Hi everyone, this is lecture 7.1, Transgender Issues. In this lecture we'll be talking about basic definitions surrounding the transgender community. Then we'll talk about medical issues in the trans community and social issues in the trans community. So let's first talk about basic definitions, because this group in particular, definitions is incredibly important. So terms are changing incredibly quickly because this is an area of incredibly rapid social change. So one common confusion or frustration with people that aren't really plugged into the trans community is that what words are polite and what words are impolite change very quickly. And the trans community doesn't do that to be aggravating, doesn't do that to make fun of people or make people feel bad. It does it because this is an area of incredibly fast social change. And whenever that happens, as society changes, words change as well. And it's good to know what you're up on. So first, a transgender person is someone who feels that their gender does not fit in with the social norms imposed on them based on their perceived sex. Remember, gender and sex are different things. Gender is your behavior. Sex is the biological condition of your body. Transgender may be heterosexual, bisexual, or homosexual. Just because you're transgender doesn't dictate necessarily how your sexuality behaves or how your gender identity, how your sexuality behaves. As of 2016, just the word trans seems to be replacing transgender as the socially acceptable term. So this community would now like to be preferred to be called the trans community. A transsexual person is a person who feels the need to seek some sort of sex reassignment. This term is becoming obsolete. I'll talk more about that later in this lecture. Now, a transvestite is a person who enjoys wearing clothing of the opposite sex. That is a unrelated and different phenomena, but transvestites are sometimes confused the phenomena are sometimes confused, but they're completely different phenomena. And just kind of as a point of, well, isn't that interesting? Typically, transvestites are heterosexual men, but it's a different social phenomenon. There are some more commonly confused terms here. First, the transition is when a person chooses to switch between male or female. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's tied in with the transsexual idea. Helpful terms for discussing the transition, you might want to use the term MTF, which is a trans person who is transitioning from being male to female. FTM refers to a person who is transitioning from female to male. Cisgender is another term that comes up in conversations about the trans community. A cisgender person is an individual whose gender identity matches the sex they were born with, i.e., most people in society are cisgender. Statistically, you are probably a cisgender person. Cisgender is not an insulting term. Sometimes when a new word is introduced and used on the internet, and sometimes used incorrectly on the internet, it is sometimes used as an insult, just like in some extremely feminist communities, typical man could be called, that could be an insult. Oh, what a typical guy, right? Oh, what a cisgender thing to do, right? Those are not the intended purpose of those words. Cisgender is simply a person who is not transgender, effectively, is how you use it linguistically, right? And why do we need this term cisgender and transgender? So that when we talk about people who aren't trans, we don't just call them normal people, right? By having a word for people who aren't trans, it makes trans people not, therefore, abnormal. Here are a whole lot more basic definitions talking about transgender oppression. Transgender oppression can take several forms, so we use different terms to discuss those forms of oppression. Traditional sexism is the belief that maleness and masculinity are superior to femaleness and femininity. This obviously can impact trans people in a number of ways, but it's basically the same type of sexism that cisgender women face. Transphobia, much like homophobia, is an irrational fear, aversion to, or discrimination against people whose gendered identities, appearances, or behaviors deviate from societal norms. Obviously, this is relatively similar to homophobia, but it applies directly to the trans community. There certainly are plenty of people who are not homophobic but are transphobic. Yeah. Cissexism is the belief that transsexuals or transgender people, their identified genders are inferior to or less authentic than those of cissexuals. So what does that mean? Basically, the belief that it's bad for a trans person to transition, right? That that's not a MTF trans person isn't a real woman, or an FTM trans guy is not a real man. Those idea of real woman and real man, those are cis sexist ideas. Genderism, then, is the belief that traditional male and female gender expressions are superior to all other gender expressions. That is obviously closely tied with all of these ideas, but basically it's the belief that men should behave this way, women should behave that way, and there is no in-between there. Again, another closely associated idea, oppositional sexism, the belief that male and female are rigid, mutually exclusive categories, right? There are only, or only should be, very masculine men and very feminine women, right? And obviously it's completely illogical to say that there are only those two categories of people, but the oppositional sexist person would say, well, maybe there are other kinds of people, but that's the way it should be. And then transmisogyny occurs when an MTF person is criticized for not only for not passing, but not living up to female gender norms. So if a trans lady is criticized for not being girly enough or not being ladylike enough, that also can happen to FTM people. But it's not as common. The reason it's not as common can really be tied in to a lot of patriarchal issues in our society, right? Women are held to higher standards regarding gendered behavior than men are. Yeah. So let's talk about some medical issues relating to the trans community. So the transition, that's when a trans person decides, if they decide to physically, socially, and biochemically transition from one sex to another. So the transition is a very personal process, and for that reason, if you wouldn't ask a person about their sex life, right? If you wouldn't ask about them whatever, about like how they have sex, you probably shouldn't ask them about their transition because it's a very, very personal thing. This process is incredibly expensive. It's incredibly socially difficult, so even if you do have the money to afford it, you still have to tell your mother about it. You have to tell your coworkers about it, right? And that's hard. The transition includes that social component. It includes a hormonal component. So many trans people decide to take hormones of the sex that they want to transition into. And then also surgical components. But there is no definitive end point for the transition. It's up to the individual person for when the trans person feels whole. Many trans people only undergo hormone therapy. Some trans people only do social transition. They feel that their body doesn't need the hormonal or surgical component. And some trans people do social, hormonal, and surgical transitioning. So the popular imagination, so society as a whole has paid a lot of attention to the surgical component of the transition. Some of that may be pure curiosity, and then sometimes that curiosity gets to the point where it's rude. Particularly the transition from male to female. So when a man is transitioning into becoming a woman, the way you would put it in clunky terms, right? There have been criticisms of society as a whole that the reason that we are so interested in that MTF transition is because as a society we've decided that the most important thing to a man is his penis. And thus, the worst thing that he could do is to choose to remove his own penis, right? That is a more or less valid critique of our society as a whole as to why we're so obsessed with the MTF transition. Now, some advocates for the trans community argue that transitions should start before adolescence if possible. That is really fraught with a lot of ethical issues, right? But the reason they make that argument is that those who transition before adolescence pass dramatically better because the unwanted hormonal impacts of puberty do not take place, right? So when a male enters puberty, obviously we all know this, right? Their height can get much higher, their voice lowers. All of these things that we associate with manness or unwomanness, or vice versa, right? Similar things happen with ladies. I did need to explain how a man becomes a woman, how a man becomes a man, woman becomes a woman. Now, obviously there are ethical issues to this, right? So, just like the rest of the LGBT community, some children do actually know their gender identities. They know if they're trans from the very, very beginning. Sorry about that. Other people know them from, other people know it later on, right? So it really takes a lot of transition there, and it really takes a lot of nuance to the individual. It really takes a lot of work, right? And you have to know the individual person. So for this reason, really broad-reaching kind of effects like this really have to be taken into account. So the term transsexual, as I referred, is falling out of favor in the trans community. This is largely due to the overwhelming attention paid to the transition by cisgender people. Thus, really because of this overwhelming attention being paid to the trans community, that term transsexual is falling away. Just like we don't talk about cisgender people's genitals either, right? It's an impolite thing to talk about. Trans people have been and are subjected to heavy social medicalization. This is largely due to medical procedures needed in many trans people's transitions. So they do have to see doctors to make things happen. Treatments in our medical system do require diagnosis and billing, right? Because we know how health insurance works. So in order for you to get your amoxicillin to take care of your cold, you need to be diagnosed with having a cold. In order to have your surgery to transition, there needs to be a medical diagnosis tied in there. For that reason, that backs up a lot of why people emphasize the being trans, right? But this over-medicalization can really be quite harmful to the trans community and the trans individual. The medical model additionally ignores the positive aspects of being trans. So for example, a trans person can have unique perspectives on having been male, having been female, and what that does to them as a person. And these can be really wise observations. However, if we treat it in a purely medical way, it's treated as if it were a condition such as health disease or a skin disorder, and that really is not really super helpful for a lot of trans people. Now let's talk about some social issues. So MTFs are specifically oppressed by the patriarchy. So males who transition into being female, they are hypersexualized in our culture. The artificialness of their vaginas is often emphasized in conversations about being trans. And in media, and in particularly in pornography, trans ladies are portrayed as trying to trick heterosexual males into having sex with them. And I've heard a lot of these conversations, not just in media, but between people. And it really makes some assumptions that trans people are inherently sexually deviant, which is not fair. Additionally, MTF people are always portrayed in order to emphasize the frivolous nature of their femaleness. So they're typically heavily make-upped. They're typically wearing very elaborate dress or very traditionally female-type dress. And that is not fair for the individual either, right? I do not, most days, right, because I teach online and I'm often stay-at-home dadding, right? I'm not dressed up to be particularly masculine. I'm just kind of dressed up, you know, as if I were to go to the grocery store. So, additional issues that trans people deal with are microaggressions. A microaggression is a verbal or physical action regarded as an instance of indirect or subtle insult to members of a marginalized group. Microaggressions are often based on implicit biases, thus intentionality is irrelevant, right? So it doesn't matter if you meant to insult the person, you still insulted the person. That's the thing about a microaggression. And often, many microaggressions are accidental, but they cause psychological trauma, and over time they cause psychological trauma, right? So examples of microaggressions, so microaggression against a black teen could be something like, oh, you're so well spoken. Well, why are you telling me I'm so well spoken, right? It's because you assumed by looking at me, the black teen, I'm not black, by the way, you're looking at me, the black teen, you're assuming that I inherently can't speak, right? So against a woman, this would be, oh, you look so good today. You should wear dresses more often, right? If the woman typically wears pants, right? That is a microaggression. That is saying to the woman, I expect you to wear dresses more often. I wish you wore dresses more often, and I want you to dress like this more often. Which, you know, one act, if that was the only time it ever happened, it wouldn't be a microaggression. The most common microaggressions against trans people involve misgendering. So misgendering is either intentional or unintentionally calling someone by the incorrect name or pronouns. Many trans people prefer to be called by he or she, but some prefer they. And this could also be applied to other people in the LGBTQ community. But you know, gender fluidity is really making this an interesting thing in our society. We have to figure out pronouns in a new way, which is interesting. Now, one thing that held up many academically minded people or editing or English language people is that in traditional English, there was no grammatically correct gender-neutral pronoun, right? So either you are he or you are she, and they only applied to a group of people. However, in the last couple years, the MLA and most other language associations have agreed that they is now a perfectly acceptable pronoun for any person to be called, right? So they is acceptable. So feel free to use they as a gender-neutral pronoun. Additionally, dead naming is also a problem for people who are in the trans community, right? So if you've transitioned, you want your name, you want to be called Lisa, but before your transition, you were called Joseph, and then someone insists on calling you Joseph instead of Lisa, that's dead naming. That is particularly difficult when loved ones or friends insist on calling a person by their dead name. And that can be something that can be particularly hard for parents or family members, but if they want to really respect the life choices and the gender identity of the trans person, they really should, to the best of their ability, transition into that new name. So trans people are not a protected class nationwide. For this reason, hate crime laws that protect trans people are based on locality, which is really scary. So if you're a trans person and you're safe living where you live, but you have to drive across a couple states to go visit a friend, right? You can't be guaranteed that if you got in a car accident on the way over, that if, God forbid, you were a victim of a hate crime, that you would be protected in that way. And that's really terrifying. Additionally, other common examples of discrimination of trans people include refusing to rent to a trans person, refusing to hire to a trans person. Bathroom issues are a very public problem that we're talking about as a society. So the inability to go to the bathroom when you're in public, that's a big issue for the trans people. And being refused service in restaurants, etc. In many areas, it is illegal to discriminate someone because they're trans, but in some places it's not. And that's largely dependent on the fact that we're going through a time of great social change. Violence against trans people is especially common, especially MTF trans people, so males who are transitioning to being female, right? Again, that's probably tied to the patriarchy. And especially for black MTF trans people, they suffer particularly high rates of assault tied to their identities. And as I mentioned before, trans people are not covered by national hate crime legislation. Where they are protected, it is a local thing. Finally, nearly 2 times as many trans people have attended a 4-year college, right? So think about that for a second. Nearly twice as many trans people as the general population have attended college. That's a good thing. But they are nearly 4 times as likely to earn less than $10,000 per year due to persistent unemployment discrimination. So a trans person is twice as likely to get a college education, but 4 times as likely to earn either poor or actual federally poor wages. And that's due to homelessness, lack of health insurance, because if you don't have health insurance, you have to pay more out of pocket. And 40% of trans people have committed suicide at one point in their life or another. So this, even if you aren't tied directly to the trans community, this is a group of people that suffer really severely in our society. So it's really up to all of us who aren't trans to really help them to the best of our ability in society, because they face a lot of not pleasant things, a lot of garbage. Okay, so that's my lecture. I will talk to you soon, and let me know if you need anything.